Occupied Netherlands, spring 1943. The early morning light, still thin and watery over the North Sea, offered little comfort to the German interceptor pilots scrambling from Deelen Air Base. Their mission: engage an American bomber formation, reportedly B-25 Mitchells, heading inland. These medium bombers, with their squat, almost ungainly profiles, had begun appearing with increasing regularity in the skies over Western Europe. Yet their perceived threat remained curiously low among the seasoned Jagdflieger. This perception, born of initial encounters, would soon be violently disabused, shattering established tactical assumptions and rewriting the calculus of air-to-air engagement. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a flight leader with II Group Jagdgeschwader 1, cinched his harness, the leather creaking softly against his flight suit. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, White 7, idled with a throaty rumble on the concrete apron. Richter, with 18 confirmed victories against British and American aircraft, had faced the lumbering B-17s and B-24s, understanding their formidable defensive arrays. The B-25, however, struck him and his comrades as a less serious proposition, a mere distraction before the heavy bomber streams arrived. Early intelligence summaries, based on limited combat reports, had emphasized its relatively small bomb load and what appeared to be a standard, though not exceptional, defensive armament. The prevailing German doctrine, refined through years of combat against British and then American heavy bombers, focused on exploiting perceived weaknesses. For the B-17, this often meant frontal attacks, targeting the cockpit and engines, or high-angle passes to avoid the concentrated waist gunners. Initial reports regarding the B-25, however, suggested a less robust forward defense than its larger counterparts. Reconnaissance photographs, often grainy and taken from altitude, depicted a relatively clean nose section, seemingly devoid of the dense clusters of machine guns that characterized the B-17's chin turret or the B-24's nose. Production logs from North American Aviation, later captured and analyzed, confirmed the early B-25B and B-25C models indeed carried a modest forward armament, typically two fixed 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, fired by the pilot, and sometimes a single flexible 50 caliber gun, operated by the bombardier. This configuration, while standard for a medium bomber of its era, did not inspire the same dread as the B-17's evolving chin turrets, which by 1943 could bring 4 or more heavy machine guns to bear directly forward. The strategic implication for the Luftwaffe was clear. These were targets of opportunity, less dangerous to approach head-on. This initial assessment, however, failed to account for the rapid field modifications and design iterations North American was implementing. The B-25's inherent adaptability, not immediately apparent from initial intelligence, allowed for significant and swift changes. The German pilots, relying on outdated information and limited direct experience, were about to encounter a very different machine than the one described in their briefing packets. The air, still cool and damp, held the scent of aviation fuel and the unspoken certainty of a routine engagement. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, piloted by Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Weber, closed on the American formation, its Daimler-Benz DB605A engine humming a familiar, powerful thrum. Below, the B-25s, lumbering and seemingly slow, maintained their course with a stubborn, almost defiant rhythm. Weber had seen these bombers before, often from a distance, and the intelligence briefings had consistently downplayed their defensive capabilities, particularly from the front. They were considered targets of opportunity, often engaged after the heavier B-17s and B-24s had been dealt with, or when fuel and ammunition allowed for a less challenging pursuit. The standard German assessment, derived from early combat reports and captured airframes, categorized the B-25 as a medium bomber, less armored, less heavily armed than its 4-engined counterparts, and therefore less of a threat. His wingman, Feldwebel Erich Krumm, positioned his own Bf-109 to Weber's left, their formation tight, a textbook approach for an attack run against what they anticipated would be minimal forward resistance. The B-25's design, with its relatively short nose and glazed bombardier's position, suggested limited space for substantial defensive armament. German reconnaissance photographs, meticulously analyzed at squadron level, showed what appeared to be a pair of 1050 caliber machine guns, perhaps even .30 caliber, mounted in the nose. This configuration, while not negligible, was hardly a deterrent against a determined head-on pass from a fighter aircraft boasting 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns. The prevailing doctrine emphasized swift, decisive passes, exploiting the B-25's perceived vulnerability. Damage assessments from earlier engagements, compiled in Luftwaffe technical reports, indicated that B-25s often sustained hits in the fuselage and wing sections with relative ease, suggesting lighter construction than the American heavy bombers. The twin-engine configuration, while robust for medium-altitude bombing, was not designed for the punishing environment of a fighter engagement. Production logs from American factories, later obtained through intelligence channels, confirmed that B-25s prioritized speed and payload capacity over heavy defensive armament in their initial designs, further reinforcing the German perception. This strategic choice, driven by the need for a versatile medium bomber, inadvertently contributed to the underestimation of its potential for self-defense. As Weber brought his fighter into a steeper dive, preparing for the initial pass, his targeting reticle settled on the lead bomber. The distance closed rapidly, the B-25's silhouette growing larger, more defined. The expectation was a relatively straightforward attack, a burst of cannon fire into the cockpit or engines, followed by a swift breakaway. The tactical manuals, based on countless simulations and actual combat reports, outlined this exact maneuver as highly effective against such targets. The psychological advantage was also significant. The sight of a fighter bearing down was often enough to cause a break in formation, making subsequent passes even easier. Then, the air ahead of the B-25 erupted, not with the expected sparse, scattered tracers, but with a sudden, dense torrent of fire, a solid wall of incandescent projectiles, each a .50 caliber round, tore through the air, converging directly on Weber's approach vector. The sheer volume was staggering, far beyond what any German pilot had been briefed to expect from a B-25. It was as if the entire nose of the bomber had transformed into a single, continuous stream of lethal energy, a devastating surprise. The aircraft was not just armed, it was bristling. "Mein God," Weber murmured, instinctively yanking his stick back, the sudden maneuver throwing his body against the harness. The B-25, far from being a harmless target, had unveiled a formidable and utterly unexpected defense. Occupied France, August 1943. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6, piloted by Hauptmann Klaus Richter, banked sharply, its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine screaming, as it lined up for another pass on the formation of B-25 Mitchells. The initial encounters had been deceptively easy, the twin-engine bombers appearing ponderous, their early models seemingly vulnerable from the front. A perception rooted in intelligence reports detailing the B-25CD's limited forward-firing armament, typically two fixed .50 caliber machine guns and a bombardier-operated flexible .30 caliber. This tactical assessment, disseminated through Luftwaffe channels, had led many fighter pilots to believe a head-on attack, or a high-angle quarter attack, offered the safest approach with minimal risk. Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had seen the damage inflicted by American heavy bombers, but the B-25, with its medium bomber designation, seemed a different proposition, less formidable than the B-17s or B-24s that often flew with heavier escort. His after-action report from the previous week noted the relative ease with which his Staffel had broken up a B-25 formation over the English Channel, claiming 2 bombers without loss. The standard operating procedure for engaging such targets emphasized attacking from angles that exploited perceived weak points, often the tail or belly, but the head-on pass was increasingly favored against these newer, less armored twin-engine types. This particular formation, however, held an unsettling difference. As Richter closed to 400 meters, his eyes, trained to spot muzzle flashes, registered an impossible density of fire erupting from the lead bomber's nose. It was not the sparse, intermittent flashes of 2 .50 caliber guns, but a continuous, interwoven stream of tracer fire, a veritable wall of incandescent projectiles. His wingman, Oberleutnant Schmidt, flying slightly to Richter's left, broke radio silence with a startled expletive, the sound of his own cannon fire momentarily cutting out. Damage reports from downed B-25s, recovered by ground crews after earlier raids, had begun to paint a different picture, but the intelligence had not yet fully permeated operational units. These reports, detailing modifications observed in captured wreckage, indicated the presence of multiple .50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, often 4 to 6, sometimes even 8, fixed forward-firing weapons. The B-25G and H models, specifically, were being equipped with a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose, alongside 2 to 4 .50 caliber machine guns, a formidable anti-shipping and ground attack weapon that also proved devastating in an air-to-air role. This was a radical departure from the earlier defensive philosophy. The sheer volume of fire from the lead Mitchell, later identified as a B-25H, was the direct result of these field modifications and factory standard improvements. The M4 cannon, firing a 75mm shell at a muzzle velocity of approximately 620 meters per second, could tear through the fuselage of a Bf-109 with a single hit, while the accompanying .50 caliber machine guns, each firing at a rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute, created a cone of lethal projectiles. A B-25H, with its 4 forward-firing .50 caliber guns and the 75mm cannon, could unleash an immediate, concentrated burst of destructive power that far exceeded anything the Luftwaffe pilots had anticipated from a medium bomber. The strategic implication of this increased firepower was profound. Luftwaffe tactics, honed against bombers with limited forward defense, suddenly became suicidal. A head-on attack, once considered a viable option, now meant flying directly into a storm of heavy machine gun and cannon fire. The operational logs of Jagdgeschwader 26, analyzing engagements from late 1943, showed a marked increase in fighter losses during attacks on B-25 formations, particularly when engaging from the front. The shift in armament transformed the B-25 from a precise, easy target into a flying gun platform, demanding a complete re-evaluation of engagement strategies. Richter instinctively pulled back on the stick, his Bf-109 shuddering as several rounds stitched across his left wing, tearing through the metal with an unnerving ease. The illusion of the B-25's harmlessness had been brutally shattered, replaced by the stark reality of its unexpected, devastating offensive capability. The urgency of the situation, the mounting losses, and the stark reality of the B-25's vulnerability in low-level attack profiles compelled a radical rethinking within the USAAF. General Kuter, observing the operational data and the tactical reports flowing from the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters, understood that conventional defensive armament was insufficient for the evolving mission. The B-25, designed as a medium bomber, was increasingly being pressed into service as a strafer, a role for which its original configuration was poorly suited. The existing machine gun emplacements, primarily dorsal and ventral turrets, offered protection against attacks from above and below, but left the critical forward aspect exposed during low-altitude passes against ground targets or shipping. Engineering teams, working in collaboration with field maintenance units, began to experiment with modifications that would dramatically increase the B-25's forward firepower. The initial designs focused on converting the bombardier's nose compartment, a space typically occupied by a bombardier and a Norden bomb sight, into a dedicated gun platform. This involved removing the transparent plexiglass nose cone and replacing it with a solid metal fairing, effectively transforming the bomber's silhouette. Within this new, reinforced nose, multiple Browning M250 caliber machine guns were rigidly mounted, their barrels protruding directly forward. Damage reports from early engagements informed the precise placement and number of these new guns. Analysis of bullet strikes on returning aircraft and observations of strafing runs indicated that a concentrated burst of fire directly ahead was the most effective deterrent and destructive force against ground targets and unarmored vessels. The standard modification, which quickly became known as the strafer nose, incorporated 4 to 8.50 caliber machine guns fixed to fire along the aircraft's longitudinal axis. These were often supplemented by additional gun packs mounted in blisters along the fuselage sides, each housing 2 more .50 caliber weapons, bringing the total forward firing complement to as many as 14 heavy machine guns on some variants. The technical implications of these modifications were significant. The added weight of the guns, ammunition, and steel plating in the nose shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, necessitating adjustments to flight characteristics and trim. The recoil forces generated by simultaneous firing of multiple .50 caliber machine guns were substantial, requiring structural reinforcement of the nose section and careful consideration of vibration dampening. Furthermore, the sheer volume of ammunition required for sustained strafing runs, each .50 caliber round weighing approximately 4.5 ounces, demanded larger internal ammunition bays, often displacing other equipment or fuel. Production logs indicate that by late 1943, dedicated conversion kits were being manufactured in the United States, allowing field units to rapidly transform their existing B-25s into these heavily armed strafing platforms. The strategic rationale behind this radical armament upgrade was clear: to create an aircraft capable of overwhelming enemy ground defenses and lightly armored targets with a torrent of heavy machine gun fire. This transformation reflected a broader tactical shift from high-altitude precision bombing to low-level interdiction and close air support, particularly in theaters where air superiority was contested or ground targets were numerous and dispersed. The ideological implication was a commitment to direct aggressive engagement, turning a medium bomber into a flying artillery piece, a stark departure from its original design philosophy. The B-25, once a symbol of methodical destruction from above, was now poised to become an instrument of direct, visceral assault. The tactical shift, born of necessity and observation, transformed the B-25 from a conventional medium bomber into a formidable ground attack platform. Initially conceived for high-altitude precision bombing, its early deployments often saw it operating in formations, dropping ordnance from several thousand feet, a role where its defensive armament was primarily reactive, designed to ward off interceptors rather than actively engage ground targets. The realization that its robust airframe and ample internal volume could accommodate heavier forward-firing weaponry fundamentally altered its operational doctrine. This evolution was not a sudden decree, but a gradual adaptation, documented through after-action reports and armament specialist recommendations. Early field modifications, often improvised by maintenance crews, involved bolting additional machine guns into the bombardier's compartment, or even fabricating rudimentary mounts for 50 caliber weapons in the nose. These ad hoc solutions, while effective in isolated instances, highlighted the potential for a standardized, factory-installed configuration that could maximize offensive firepower without compromising structural integrity or flight performance. North American aviation's engineers, responding to these field requirements and the pressing need for more effective close air support, began integrating the modifications directly into the production line. The most prominent example was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose, a weapon originally designed for tanks. This heavy cannon, firing a 15-pound projectile, could penetrate light armor and demolish fortified positions with devastating effect. Its inclusion signaled a profound departure from the bomber's original design philosophy, shifting its primary engagement profile from area bombing to direct, focused assault. Subsequent variants, such as the B-25H and J models, further refined this ground attack capability. The B-25H, for instance, combined the 75mm cannon with an array of 450 caliber machine guns in the nose, alongside additional fuselage-mounted weapons, bringing the total forward-firing armament to an unprecedented level for a medium bomber. Production logs confirm that thousands of these heavily armed variants rolled off the assembly lines, representing a significant portion of the total B-25 output during the latter half of the war. These aircraft were not merely bombers with added guns. They were purpose-built instruments of destruction, designed to strafe, suppress, and obliterate ground targets with overwhelming force. The strategic implications were far-reaching. Commanders now possessed an aircraft capable of delivering both high-explosive bombs and sustained, heavy-caliber fire against entrenched positions, convoys, and even naval vessels. This dual capability provided unparalleled flexibility in tactical planning, allowing a single B-25 squadron to transition from a bombing mission to a strafing run with minimal reconfiguration. The ideological shift was equally significant. The B-25, once a symbol of strategic bombing doctrine, became a potent symbol of tactical air power, directly supporting ground forces and shaping the immediate battlefield. Its transformation underscored the dynamic nature of aerial warfare and the constant interplay between technological innovation and operational necessity. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, honed over years of aerial combat, faced an unexpected challenge. Fighter units, particularly those tasked with bomber interdiction, had developed standard attack profiles based on the known vulnerabilities of Allied aircraft. A typical approach against a medium bomber involved a high-speed pass from astern, targeting the tail and wings, or a head-on attack designed to disrupt formation and force evasive maneuvers, exploiting the perceived weakness of frontal armament. The B-25's transformation, however, rendered these established tactics increasingly perilous. Damage reports from downed German fighters and captured pilot interrogation files revealed a stark shift in combat outcomes. Before the widespread deployment of the heavily armed B-25G and H models, frontal attacks on medium bomber formations carried a relatively low risk of immediate catastrophic damage to the attacking fighter. Pilots often reported light to moderate damage from .50 caliber rounds, requiring repairs but rarely resulting in immediate loss. After mid-1943, however, the probability of a German fighter sustaining critical damage or being shot down during a head-on pass against a B-25 formation surged dramatically. The concentration of firepower, particularly the 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns on the B-25H, created a cone of lethal projectiles that even heavily armored fighters struggled to penetrate. A single pass through this fire zone could result in hundreds of impacts, shredding control surfaces, disabling engines, or incapacitating pilots. Unit diaries from JG-27 and JG-53 operating in the Mediterranean and Western Front, began to reflect a growing reluctance among pilots to engage B-25 formations head-on, citing the wall of lead encountered. This tactical reevaluation had significant strategic implications. German Fighter Command was compelled to divert resources and training efforts to develop new engagement profiles. Pilots were instructed to prioritize attacks from the flanks or from below, attempting to exploit perceived blind spots or areas with less concentrated defensive fire. This shift, however, often meant longer engagement times, increased fuel consumption, and reduced opportunities for decisive strikes before the bombers reached their targets. The psychological impact also manifested in reduced pilot morale when facing these heavily armed formations. The B-25's aggressive frontal armament thus forced a fundamental rethinking of German fighter doctrine against medium bombers. It was no longer a matter of simply engaging an enemy. It was about surviving the engagement itself. The modifications to the B-25, particularly the shift towards a more aggressive forward-firing armament, fundamentally altered its tactical utility. This was not a subtle adjustment, but a deliberate re-envisioning of the aircraft's role, moving it beyond its initial medium-altitude bombing remit. The AAF board report, dated March 1943, detailed the operational necessity for increased ground attack capabilities in certain theaters, specifically citing the need for sustained, concentrated fire against hardened targets and troop concentrations. Early iterations of the B-25, while robust, possessed a relatively modest forward-firing capacity, typically limited to 2.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, sometimes augmented by additional flexible mounts. The B-25C and D models, for instance, carried a maximum of 4 fixed forward guns, a respectable but not overwhelming volume of fire. This configuration was deemed adequate for suppressing light anti-aircraft positions during bombing runs, but insufficient for dedicated strafing passes against entrenched infantry or armored vehicles. The B-25G, however, marked a significant departure, integrating a 75mm N4 cannon into its nose, a weapon previously confined to tanks and naval vessels. This cannon, firing a high-explosive shell weighing 15 pounds, offered a devastating punch against bunkers, locomotives, and even some light tanks, a capability entirely absent from earlier medium bombers. While the cannon's rate of fire was slow, typically 4 rounds per minute, its destructive power compensated for the limited shot count. Subsequent models, notably the B-25H and J, further amplified this trend, often at the expense of bomb load or defensive turrets. The B-25H, for instance, paired the 75mm cannon with 4 fixed .50 caliber machine guns in the nose and an additional 4.50 caliber guns in side blisters, creating a formidable forward-firing array of 8 heavy machine guns and 1 cannon. This concentration of firepower was unprecedented for a medium bomber and transformed the aircraft into a flying artillery piece, capable of delivering a sustained barrage of heavy machine gun fire alongside the cannon's explosive impact. The B-25J, particularly the Strafer variants, solidified this role, often mounting a total of 14.50 caliber machine guns, with 8 fixed in the nose and 4 in blister packs along the fuselage, all firing forward. Damage assessment reports from the Southwest Pacific Theater, compiled between late 1943 and early 1945, frequently noted the extensive destruction wrought by these strafing runs, particularly against Japanese logistics and troop movements. One such report from New Guinea, dated November 1944, documented the complete obliteration of a Japanese truck convoy by a single B-25J Strafer squadron, with an estimated 80% vehicle destruction rate attributed to the concentrated .50 caliber fire. The sheer volume of lead that could be projected forward by these later B-25 models created a distinct tactical advantage in ground support operations. German fighter pilots, accustomed to engaging bombers primarily as high-altitude threats, were ill-prepared for the B-25's aggressive, low-level strafing tactics. Their training emphasized interception at altitude, not close-quarters engagement with an aircraft designed to saturate ground targets with fire. The shift in armament meant the B-25 was no longer merely a bomber. It had become a potent ground attack platform, a role it embraced with devastating effectiveness. The B-25 Mitchell's operational history, from its early, relatively lightly armed iterations to the bristling gun-laden attack platforms, provided a tangible blueprint for the evolving concept of air superiority and ground attack. This trajectory, born of immediate combat necessity and refined through iterative field modifications, demonstrated a profound adaptability within a single airframe, influencing subsequent design philosophies. The transformation from a medium bomber to a dedicated strafer, particularly evident in the G and H models, showcased the potential for multi-role aircraft, a concept that would become central to post-war aviation. Examination of post-war aircraft development logs reveals a consistent thread of specialized attack variants derived from general-purpose airframes, echoing the Mitchell's path. Designers, armed with the lessons of the B-25, began to integrate heavy forward-firing armament as a primary consideration rather than an afterthought. The tactical flexibility afforded by an aircraft capable of both high-altitude bombing and low-level ground suppression resonated deeply within Air Force command structures, leading to a reevaluation of mission profiles and aircraft procurement strategies. The sheer volume of firepower concentrated in the Mitchell's nose, reaching 850 caliber machine guns or a 75mm cannon on some models, established a new benchmark for airborne offensive capability. Production records indicate that over 9,800 Mitchells were ultimately built, a testament to its utility and the efficacy of its various configurations. This scale of deployment, coupled with its demonstrable impact on battlefield operations, cemented the idea that a medium bomber could be repurposed and re-engineered to excel in roles far beyond its initial design brief.